Section 1.2 deals with species changing over time. So if we think about something that's not living and how that has changed over time, we could look at the car, for example. It started out as the Ford Model T, and obviously as the years went on, many things about the car evolved or changed over time. Now we find that cars are mostly computer operated and run on different types of fuel besides the diesel engine that the Ford Model T probably used. So evolution just means how things change over time and usually that occurs through adaptations. One of the most famous individuals to deal with this particular aspect of science was Charles Darwin. He sailed the world for 5 years in a ship known as the HMS Beagle. One of the things that he studied were finches found on the Galapagos Islands, and you can see a little bit of his research or a summary of his research on page 20 in your book. Throughout this, he proposed the theory of natural selection in the early 1800s to describe how new species develop over time. So your book defines natural selection as the process by which organisms that are best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce. This is compared to artificial selection, which is when humans intervene and they produce a new species of organism over a period of time by selecting organisms with desired traits and breeding them together. And this can be done with animals and plants. There are a few key principles of natural selection, and this again is found on page 22. First principle is the principle of overproduction. What this means in summary is that organisms reproduce more offspring than can actually survive. An excellent example of this is bacteria. Bacteria reproduce prolifically. They just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce, and that's pretty much all they do. And it's kind of the assumption that not all of the organisms will be able to survive their environment. So you have this principle that is called overproduction. In addition to this, you have something called variation. Variation is an inherited trait that makes one organism different from another of the same species. So for example, if you're talking about breeds of dog, you can have 2 Labrador retrievers that are basically the same. They're the same species. However, there are considerable differences between 2 individual dogs. And you can also think of the domesticated dog as breeds being within the species of dog. So you've got a Schnauzer and you compare that to a Golden Retriever, and those are some significant differences in the same species of organism. And it's important to remember that variation exists within all populations of organisms, from bacteria all the way up to really large animals. Another principle of natural selection is the idea of adaptation. So this is an inherited trait that gives an organism some sort of advantage to their survival. So perhaps an animal the environment that the animal's in has changed over time, and the animal has adapted to that change and actually passed that trait on to future offspring as it has adapted. And finally, selection. Selection refers to those organisms with the best adaptations being able to survive the longest and reproduce the most. And this is where we get the idea of survival of the fittest. And finally, mutation. Mutation is a variation that occurs in the DNA of an organism. This is a permanent change in that DNA, in a gene or on a chromosome, that can then be passed down from parent to offspring throughout generations. And all of these things lead to something called speciation. Speciation is the development of a new species from an existing species. It may occur when the environment changes very dramatically, such as there is a massive flood, or it can occur gradually over time as the environment changes through various abiotic factors like weathering and erosion or plate tectonic shifting. For two examples of speciation, take a look at the pictures, illustrations, and diagrams on page 20, which refers to speciation of finches, and cichlids, which is a type of fish, on page 24. The concept of isolation is essential to speciation. For a species to separate, two populations have to be completely prevented from reproducing with each other, and that usually happens because of some environmental effect, like a river changes direction, and or an earthquake kind of creates this canyon that species of organisms now can no longer reproduce with each other, and therefore these two groups are now isolated from each other, and mutations and variation can happen within those groups, and eventually over time, long periods of time, new species can form. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free